it something fairly regular and established. This has been such a great thing that Scott has done. It's just been amazing for those of you that have been here to enjoy it with us. And they're all available on YouTube, and he'll talk about the availability of that to see it. But going forward, I was thinking it'd be kind of neat to have, this doesn't just have to be Science Sunday, it can be History Sunday sometimes too, and Social Sciences Sunday, or a lot of different areas that are of interest to you. So I'd look for anybody that has some interest to maybe commit to once a month coming up and presenting something starting next year in September. Talk to me about it, and we'll get that going. We've got these 2 weeks here that the church so kindly gives us to search for our searches for truth and meaning, and it's really important to keep using it and keep sharing times together about this. In 2 weeks, I'm going to have a Science Sunday, and I've been debating about a couple of different ideas that I'd like to talk about. And one was the sixth extinction that Scott mentioned a little bit ago, and the challenges that are going on in the climate and the culture and the world right now. And then there's some aspects of it that really tie it down much smaller. And one is speciation. What's a species, and what makes something be a species? If we're going to protect species, then we can't really define what makes something be a species. So then you're in some level of trouble of developing and determining how you want to protect this world. So interesting topics coming up. That'll be in 2 weeks. And other than that, we're coming to the end of this year. It ends in the May terms. The May times will be finishing up with that, and then we'll have the summer to relax and enjoy it. It looks like it's warming up for us. So with no further ado, Scott Thompson.
Good morning, science lovers.
Good morning.
It's kind of become my standard greeting. I think it's pretty delightful, and I hope you all enjoy being here as much as I do. Beginning to wrap up a 2-year series of programs I call the Quest series, and we've talked about, last year we talked about a lot of the hard sciences, things like cosmology and symmetry theory and particle physics and relativity and all of that. This year we talked about the origin of life, we've talked about evolution, and then we're going to spend a couple of talks, beginning with the last talk, about some social science issues. We talked last time about economics, and this particular talk I want to spend at least about 3 or 5 minutes catching up with some of the economics issues, because they're going to be relevant to today's topic of critical thinking. You may find information about our group, the Humanists of West Suburban Chicagoland, on meetup.com. That's the primary website we use to communicate our events and activities. And we also have a YouTube channel. If you search for Quest or Unitarian Universalists or Humanist Science Lectures, any number of YouTube searches will bring you there. And also on the Meetup page, there's a discussion section that has a permanent link to our YouTube site. So we were talking about economics last time, and we didn't have a chance to finish all rats, right? A couple things I rushed through last month as we were wrapping up. Economics has this idea of perverse incentives. Some rat farmers in Hanoi decided that, or not rat farmers, that's ridiculous, some officials in Hanoi decided that they would pay people to bring in dead rats because they had a rat problem, right? So what better way to clean up your rats than to create an economic incentive for people to catch them, kill them, and bring proof? Well, that led to rat farmers. People started raising rats so that they could collect money from the government. That's called a perverse incentive. And a lot of times in the union of political and economic ideas, we end up with things like perverse incentives. Another perverse incentive is the idea of rent control.
Many people are in favor of rent control. Many politicians are in favor of rent control. They believe that if you impose a cap on how much people should pay for a particular type of residence, that will ensure that poor people will have residence that they can afford. Well, what ends up happening with that is that sends a very strong signal to the people who are building houses and apartments. And that signal is, you're not going to make much money. So don't bother by building middle class or lower class housing, lower income class housing. Instead, buy and build expensive elite apartments because they're not subject to rent control. You can get more profit as a builder by doing that. So it actually leads to a housing shortage. Rent control leads to a housing shortage. And nobody intended that, right? It's an unintended consequence, and it ends up being a perverse incentive for people who might otherwise construct housing. Another example of unintended consequences, you can probably see where this one is going. In Delhi, the colonial British government paid people for dead cobras. Guess what they started? Raising and breeding cobras. And then the government canceled the program. What did the people do with their extra cobras? It was not a success. So we have to be careful in the union of politics and economics to make intentional decisions and to think clearly about what the repercussions might be. I believe, and it's not just me, but I'm expressing my opinion here, I believe that if we wrote legislation in such a way that we always included a clause to measure the outcome of that legislation and then validate whether that legislation in fact had its intended consequence, our quality of laws and our quality of regulation would go up if we built in that kind of feedback mechanism. Another topic in economics that I didn't cover was something called econophysics. The relationship between basic physics, things like thermodynamics and the way energy is transmitted between entities. And what does that imply for economic transactions and the way value is transmitted between entities? Econophysics is a growing field, and it's something I'm particularly interested in, having a physics background myself. And I like plumbing the depths of this topic to find interesting relationships between the physical world and the physicsy world and economics. We can look at things like the energy per dollar per unit of GDP and see how that changes over time. As people create more essentially creative output, artwork, literature, computer programs, etc., then often the energy that goes into that is a lot less than you would reasonably expect for an industrial process. All right, now I skipped over last time the two Walmarts. There's two different studies. A 2005 study by Global Insight showed that Walmart, just being in a consumer market, a market where there is competition, saves the average consumer everywhere in America, every single consumer, $2,500 a year. Some studies have said that Walmart is the single biggest contributor to people's money going further, which is like a pay raise. Walmart is the single biggest contributor to a countrywide pay raise of any single policy or institution in the past 15 or 20 years. There's another study also done in 2005. They found that Walmart had the effect of lowering wages in counties where it was present by about 2.5%. A 2006 study by the Economic Policy Institute found that Walmart can maintain the positive effects while mitigating the negative. It makes enough profits to raise worker compensation by $2,000 per employee without raising prices. So one of the problems that we get into with critical thinking is when you're presented with different and potentially conflicting data like this, which one do you believe? It may be that both of these things are true. And the real question is about one of social value, right? What do we value more? This gets into some discussions about something of progressive versus regressive pricing and taxation. You're all probably familiar with progressive taxation. We all pay a progressive tax, except in the state of Illinois where they have a flat tax, and it's a really bad idea economically. In a progressive system, the price of something, like the cost of taxes that you pay, goes up as income goes up, or as its impact to you becomes less important. A regressive system tends to hurt people with less money more than it hurts people with more money. Anytime you raise the price of a staple commodity, like food or gasoline, it tends to be regressive in its economic impact. It hurts poorer people more. You still have to buy food, you still have to buy gasoline, and you don't have a lot of money to begin with. It tends to hurt poorer people more. That's why a lot of economists, and I agree with these economists, I'm not an economist, but I agree with them, is that helping poor people by providing them with more money, or helping them save more money, or refunding them more money from their taxes tends to be a much greater social good than a lot of people give it credit for. If you give a relatively poorer person $1, they're likely to spend it on food, clothing, diapers, education, maybe a trip to the zoo, other things that they deem important and critical for their family. If you give a wealthy person $1, it's likely to be forgotten, lost in the shuffle. So regressive effects of price increases and flat taxes are something that a lot of people don't take into consideration. These are some books I recommend on the study of economics. Economics is called the queen of social sciences, but it is the master of the whole darn universe when it comes to getting things done. You may not buy the idea when it's stated outright, but I guarantee you nearly everybody else on the planet knows the truth of it in their very marrow. That, my friends, is why I think economics is important and why I study it. Seriously, you should too. Right. Speaking of economics, we have this guy, Alexander Hamilton. They're thinking about kicking him off of the $10 bill and replacing him with another portrait. I'm not against the other portrait, but I think it should go on the $20 bill, because Andrew Jackson, whose portrait is on the $20 bill, was against federal banking, Federal Reserve. He was anti-Treasury Department. He thought banks were evil. He thought commerce was evil. He thought big business was evil. And it was poisonous to the American economy when some of his policies were implemented. That's Andrew Jackson. This guy, Alexander Hamilton, believed that America would become a nation of industry and innovation. One of them was right. One of the other things that Alexander Hamilton said is that men are reasoning rather than reasonable animals. Apparently he knew about the theory of evolution long before Charles Darwin existed. But he recognized that just because we have the capability to reason doesn't mean that we always think reasonably. So that's what we're going to talk about today. One of the first things we're going to get through is the notion of, Mark Twain actually said this. He attributed it to Benjamin Disraeli. But Mark Twain made it famous. There are three kinds of lies in our world. Lies, damned lies, and statistics. So we're going to talk about the statistics part of lies. Here's somebody we all know. The United States has added 11 million jobs in 5 years. This was a recent comment. True. You can go back, you can fact check this. This is absolutely a true statement. The problem is, it only starts 5 years ago, right? Now, if you want to evaluate whether or not the American economy is getting better since the 2008 financial crisis, you should probably go back at least to 2008, if not a little before then. Now, I'm not casting aspersions on his comment. I'm not casting aspersions on the fact that under Obama's presidency, the economy has generally improved. How could it help but improve, given how bad things were? But you just have to be careful. When you're looking at statistics, one of the most common things that people who are trying to persuade you of their point of view do is they use something called cherry picking. They choose when to begin counting and when to end counting. And if you expand the gamut a little bit, you will often find that the conclusion you arrive at is potentially different. Here's another way to look at job growth. This is in 2015. The green areas have seen job growth, and the red areas have seen jobs decline. So isn't this a more nuanced picture of what has been happening recently? What does this tell us about our economy? Does this talk about certain sectors that have been impacted more in recent years by changes in technology, by changes in market dynamics? Maybe if you're trying to make policy, you should look at some of the nuances rather than just the absolute number of jobs that were added. Here's another view of the same kind of data. This is jobs added or lost by county. You see a lot of red in this map. A lot of counties in America are losing jobs. So you look at today's political dialogues that are happening, and why is it that a lot of people still feel like they're disenfranchised by the system? It's because we draw a lot of our political boundaries, gerrymandering notwithstanding, somewhat adherent to geography. And there's a lot of rural places where the economy is not a lot better than it was 8 or 10 years ago. When you're considering political policy, when you're considering economic policy, looking at nuance is often necessary, but it's time-consuming, and it can get a bit mentally taxing. This gets to the idea of framing your argument. Right? Somebody can persuade you about their point of view, not just by cherry-picking their statistics, but by framing it in a context that is easily accessible to you. But maybe that's too big of a chunk. Maybe the conclusion they're drawing that America has added a bunch of jobs, maybe that misses a lot of people that are feeling pain. So you can frame the argument in different ways. Here's another view, the same kind of data. All kinds of ways to look at information. If you're trying to make up your own mind about a position related to job growth and whether it's important or how important or what it means, don't just look at one statement from the president and say, oh, I understand what jobs are doing in America. If you're genuinely curious about it, dig into some of the details. It will take time, but it's better than forming a snap judgment. All right, we're going to talk about some other misleading statistics. This one, the top tax rate will soon rocket at 39.6%. Look at the huge difference in these bars. But where do they start? They start at 34%, right? So this is another way that statistics and statistical recitations by people who are trying to persuade you of something can influence your point of view. You look at this visually instead of analytically. You don't look at the numbers, you look at the picture, and you may come to the wrong conclusion. Oh my gosh, the tax rate's going up by, what is that, 5 or 6 times? No. Here's another. Over 2 million Americans exposed to drinking water will die this year. It's a global catastrophe.
How many drowned?
I don't know. Or if they drank too much.
Switch to Scotch.
Right, switch to Scotch. So everybody drinks water, and about 2 million, I haven't looked up if 2 million is the right number, but let's assume 2 million people will die in a given year given our population. Well, of those 2 million people, 100% of them will have drinking water. Right? Except for the Scotch lovers. So, beware of things like this. People try to persuade you with a correlation that you have to think more deeply about. We'll talk more about that in a moment. This is a fun one. This is mathematically true. Right? And one of the things that we can do with statistics, and I do this habitually, is whenever I see somebody reciting to me an average, If it's something I care about, I insist on knowing the standard deviation. Now, many of you may not know from a statistics background what standard deviation is, but it's the plus and minus that goes along with it. All right? So the average person has one testicle, plus or minus 1. All right? So the plus or minus can make a really big difference in how you interpret the statistics. Let's say that, and I'm making this up, I didn't look it up for this talk. Let's say that the median wage in the United States is $50,000 a year. Well, let's recast that instead of the median, which means 50% are above that number and 50% are below that number. Let's say the average wage. Let's say the average wage in America is $70,000. Why might that be? It's because huge outliers can change the average. And the average around that $70,000 may be plus or minus $30,000 for the standard deviation. So given 68% of the American population, most of them make $70,000 plus or minus $40,000. Well, that's a huge change. Minus $40,000, if you take that from 70, right, $30,000. And plus, right, is $110,000. That's a huge range. You encompass people who are in poverty and people who are wealthy. So including a standard deviation in your statistics can help you understand a nuance that might help you interpret a case where somebody's trying to hoodwink you. Here's some fun, spurious correlations. I'll just let you read these. Number of people. Anybody can't read this? Needs me to read it out loud? All of these, there's a website connoted down here. When you see this on YouTube, I'll highlight this. But there's a website just full of these. I think the fellow has published a book about them as well. They're delicious. So let's talk about more logical fallacies. Logical fallacies generally come into 3 flavors: rhetorical, logical, and cognitive. I'll give you some examples of them. I don't have time in this lecture to go through a lot of detail about some of these, but I'll mention a few. There are hundreds and hundreds of logical fallacies that have been identified. Cherry picking, we've already talked about. Ad hominem, you hear that a lot, right? She can't possibly be a good person because she once ran over a kitten, right? Whatever the case may be. Well, he can't possibly be a good president because he once smoked a joint in college, right? Unless you know of a particular causal relationship between a lifelong mental disability and smoking marijuana, that's nothing more than an ad hominem attack. That lady is a fat pig. We may have heard that recently from someone. Ad hominem attack, not a good logical argument. Guilt by association. We're all familiar with that one, right? Well, this person is a member of the humanist group, and all those humanists are immoral, right? Not true in either case. Begging the question. The world is getting worse all the time. We talked about that a couple lectures ago. Turns out not to be true by many, many different measures. But you can assert it as an unsubstantiated claim. People do that all the time. Economic inequality is a big problem. Okay, I happen to believe that that's true, but you can't just take it on face value. You should look into it. If it matters to you, figure out why economic inequality is an important issue. Try to explore what can be done about it, and is anybody talking about those things? Overgeneralization. We all know what that is. Well, all those Islamists are terrorists. We might have heard something like that, too. Right? Overgeneralization. Poisonous. Leads to stereotypes, prejudice. Circular reasoning. I don't have a Bible with me, unfortunately. Everything in this book is true because it says so. Duh. Right. One of my favorite is, no true Scotsman. No true Scotsman would be able to do that without wearing a kilt. Right? Well, it's not true, right? No true Christian would ever vote for President Obama, right? No true self-respecting human being would ever exceed the speed limit, right? I mean, these claims are just vacuous, right? They don't mean anything. President Obama smoked a joint in college. Maybe this didn't happen to my knowledge, but maybe there was a conversation that went like this. Is it true, Mr. President, that you smoked a joint in college? Well, yes, but so did you. That's too cool, right? You too. You've committed the same transgression, therefore we can talk about something else. Here's a big one. This one is really big, especially in the area that I like dealing with, which is scientific education. Personal incredulity. Well, I don't understand quantum mechanics, therefore it can't be true. Or I'm free to make my own interpretation of what it means. Because I haven't studied it, I don't know what it means. Maybe quantum mechanics tells me that I can get rich just by wishing or conducting some ritual, looking at a green laser beam. Maybe because photons are quantum, maybe if it's a green laser and green is money, then maybe I can get rich. Whatever, right? Personal incredulity. I don't understand it, so I can either make up my own solution or I can choose to reject it as a true claim. These were all rhetorical, argumentative fallacies. Logical fallacies, false dichotomy. Right? Let's see. You're either a supporter of Donald Trump or you're a supporter of Hillary Clinton. That's it. Well, it may come down to that, but that provides a kind of false dichotomy, right? That's limiting their choices. There's a whole spectrum of people with all kinds of other opinions about the way the world and government should work that are being admitted. Now, that may be eventually a true dichotomy that you're posed with, because you will have to choose either one or the other or none. But there are all kinds of false dichotomies, right? I'm going to have an example of this later, but I'm going to say it now. You're either with us or you're against us, right? Is there maybe a spectrum in between? Like, I kind of see where you're coming from, but I don't think we should rush, or whatever. Okay? Logical converses. All men are mortal. Goldfish are mortal. Therefore, goldfish are men. Right? That's a take on the classic syllogism there. Cognitive biases, a confirmation bias. This one is really insidious, especially among scientists. A statistical analysis of data and reports generated by scientific papers over the past umpteen years, I don't know the exact date without looking it up, has shown that from a statistical point of view, some of the data reported by scientists across many different fields, whether it's physics or psychology, etc., cannot be statistically true. They have cherry-picked their data. They have thrown out what they believe to be outliers, right? If you see something that looks like an outlier to you on a graph and you get rid of it, well, from a statistical standpoint, there's probably a good chance there will occasionally be outliers. So if you present data that has very few or no outliers, then you're not actually presenting the truth. And there's another problem in scientific research, a little digression here, and that is you get rewarded for finding new things. So what tends not to happen is that people go back and confirm experiments and discoveries that have already been made. And years later, sometimes you find that claim is unsubstantiated, but people have just accepted it. It's another problem in science. I'm not saying that science is all bad, but even scientists, as human beings, are subjected or are subject to some of these fallacies. Pareidolia, I'll talk about that more in a moment. It's a weird word unless you already know what it means. I'll give you some examples. Rhyming effect. This one was amazing to me. I didn't know about it until I started researching this talk. It turns out I do this all the time when I'm writing. I really like writing with rhyme and alliteration. I think it makes for beautiful, eloquent prose. It turns out that it's also called the Keats heuristic, according to which a statement's truth is assessed based upon aesthetics. If something sounds good, if it's loquacious and rhyming and it has lots of internal timing, then you're likely to be persuaded it's right.
If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit.
That is the classic example that I found on the internet. If the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Does that say anything about whether he committed a murder? No, it's just about a glove. Okay? Misapprehension, all kinds of illusions that we are subject to. I'll give you some examples of those in a moment. Big one, really big one, sunk cost fallacy. I've already invested $5,000 in that stock. I know that it's going down. I better keep holding it because I've invested $5,000 in it, even though it's only worth $2,000 today. Maybe it'll get better. Well, sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. But people, this is an amazing thing I found out. This is in Michael Shermer's book, The Mind of the Market, which I recommend. One of the things that's true is that people are more averse to losses than they are interested in gains. Right? That's why you often see things like people staying with bad jobs, bad marriages, bad investments. We are so loss averse as a species that we often don't take advantage of opportunities. You have to be cognitively aware of that. False memories. We've seen some of the dangers from that. Pareidolia. I'm sorry, this isn't really easy to see. You see the fellow's face there? Yeah. That's pareidolia. Right? Where you see faces in places where there aren't any. This is a cloud. Here's another classic example of pareidolia. The Martian. All right, here's some, I told you that illusions, optical illusions, are something that we're all built to see. You see these two brown spots under these different colored blue circles? I'm going to tell you something. These blue circles are the same color, and these brown spots are going to look vastly different in just a moment. Here's the brown spot. Let me do that again so that you can keep an eye on whatever it is you want to keep an eye on. Also, this is the same color as this and this. One more time. Ready? We all have built-in neurological programming that predisposes us to see illusions in many cases, rather than to apprehend, much less comprehend, reality. Here's another example. I don't know if it's working. If you kind of move your eyes around a little bit, it will work when it was on a small screen. It may not work up here. You perceive motion there? Yeah. So that was the point, is that you can perceive motion where there really isn't any. All right, here's some more logical fallacies. Classic argument, well supported by the evidence. Not so much. Anti-God is anti-American. Disagree. Anti-American is treason. Traitors lead to civil war. Wonderful. You can contact this guy if you'd like. I'm sure he can explain his thinking. All right, here's another logical fallacy. Which logical fallacy is this?
People or meals or whatever.
Appeal to the masses, appeal to popularity. We've sold 99 billion of these things. They must be the best burger on the planet. Right? This lady, whom I adore, Ellen DeGeneres, apparently she's telling me that CoverGirl and Olay are some of the best makeup brands. I don't know that she's studied the issue sufficiently, but she certainly has a lot of popularity, and she might be persuasive because of that. Here's another one. 2 is a number, 1 is a number, therefore, because 2 things equal a third thing, 2 is equal to 1. Right? They're both numbers, so they're both equal to a third thing, therefore they must be equal to each other. Right? Logical fallacy. Oh, this is a good one. I still believe in global warming. The Unabomber apparently said that. If the Unabomber believes in global warming, then, well, what does that make me? Somebody who believes in global warming, right? It doesn't make you a Unabomber. This was going to be a whole ad campaign. The company, this Heartland.org, had set aside a lot of money to put these billboards up around the country. It turned out that as soon as they put this billboard up in the Chicago area, donations to their organization plummeted. Thank goodness for critical thinking. This is just an assertion made out of the blue on a blue billboard. Evolution is a fairy tale for grown-ups. Really? Where's your evidence of that? It's a bold assertion. Certainly has some emotional appeal to many people. Right? Well, yeah. ScienceProvesIt.com. I wonder how much real science is there. Maybe it's Seance Proves It. All right, here's a quote from a famous man. The future must not belong to those who slander the prophet of Islam. He said that. He said that in front of the United Nations after the Charlie Hebdo attacks, the cartoonists that were assassinated. And he went through a whole litany of items that should not be a source of prejudice and should not incite violence. Worshipping the Prophet Muhammad should be one of those things. You're either with us or you're against us.
That's pretty good.
Or you're with the terrorists. Right? You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. Oh my goodness, what a choice.
Mission accomplished.
You're right. Talk about a false dichotomy. All right, I don't know what this is trying to sell. I'm sure there's some logical fallacies in here. Yeah, I've never seen a donut that big or a woman that small. I don't know. Eat a donut, get a free woman. I don't know. Right. Fluoride is a poison. Oh, and by the way, that's associated with Nazism. Oh, very scary stuff. Where's the science? There isn't much about that particular topic. And then coup de grace, pesticide resistance. I wonder what they're trying to sell here. Wow. Sex sells, huh? All right. I want to give you an example of appeal to authority. I've been brushing up on my Morgan Freeman impersonation. So bear with me. I've been looking forward to doing this. I can do some impersonations. So. Here we go. Maybe you can look at him while I'm saying this.
Hello, everybody. I would like to share with you this recently discovered wisdom. Interdependency is the continuity of subtle knowledge. The universe itself conspires to transcend mere categorization by sublimating paradox from an underlying quantum reality. In this reality, every person is a god in embryo. Its only desire is to be born into the world. The physical world, including our bodies, is a response of the observer. We create our bodies as we create the experience of our world. Meanwhile, information mediates on self-righteous observations, healing our inner souls with the divine balm of anticipated potentializations. It is these potentials which exhibit an essential energy, a sort of unmeasurable energy that grows into unexpected things, like the Higgs boson, which, after all, is the God particle. By the way, this is not a photograph of Morgan Freeman. This is a painting done
So,
on an
did Morgan Freeman say any of that? No, I did. Right? And where did I get that mumbo jumbo? Well, it turns out that there's this wonderful, absolutely wonderful program on the internet that takes bits of tweets made by Deepak Chopra and it'll string them together. I added some of my own Chopraisms into that. Yeah. So, a lot of times, just saying something that uses a lot of really complicated words that seem like they convey a deep understanding and a profound intelligence can bamboozle you, right? I mean, it sounded nice, especially when you're reading it with the most popular voice on the planet. Right. All right, so a lot of times we're torn between logic and reason, between reason and careful deliberation and the fires of passion. It turns out that to be effective thinkers and necessarily to remain human beings, we need both. Studies have shown that there are people that have a particular kind of brain damage where their connection to their emotional state has been severed. And those people tend to be paralyzed by indecision, even for common things like, do I want orange juice or do I want a glass of milk? Right? Without emotion to help us choose our preferential outcomes, without an emotion that is guided by often ethical considerations or biological considerations, we become paralyzed. A real Vulcan that has no feelings, I know that's a bit of simplification in the whole canon of Star Trek, but a real Vulcan that has no feelings could not function as an organism. We have something called intuitive heuristics in the book Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman. By the way, he was not an economist, he was a cognitive psychologist, and he won a Nobel Prize for economics because he discovered ways that people think and how they think about choices. That had a lot of impact in the field of economics. Experts encounter so many examples of a particular solution. Well, let me rephrase that. Experts, one of the things defining an expert is that they encounter so many examples of a solution to a particular set of problems, like playing chess, or looking and evaluating stocks, etc., that they incorporate the knowledge into their automatic or heuristic system of thinking. Some call it intuitive. According to Kahneman, the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, intuition is nothing more than an example of the process of recognition. And the more experience you've had in a particular domain, the more likely you are to recognize an example of something. To be able to sort out, is that a good chess move, or is that a bad chess move? I've played 50,000 games of chess. I know that's a bad chess move. I've played maybe 150, 200 games of chess. I wouldn't know. Right? This can be profoundly complicated by something called the affect heuristic, where the way we feel about things guides our decisions. It often serves as an almost invisible and effortless replacement for expertise. It feels similar to intuitive expertise built upon lots of experience, but it misleads. It entails replacing a complex question with a far more simple one, transparently. We don't even recognize it's happening sometimes. Such a thinking mode very often leads to false conclusions. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. The other system of thinking is the deliberative system, where you are cognitively aware of the way statistics can mislead, some of the traps with logical fallacies, and some of the pitfalls of non-critical thinking. And it's not just about mind over heart either. It turns out that your mind encompasses several different dispositions simultaneously. We have compartmentalization. I really want that cookie because it looks really yummy and I know what cookies do for me. They satisfy me, they provide an emotional burst. And then there's this other part of your brain that says you're 50 pounds overweight and you shouldn't have that cookie. Some of us find that that battle is often won by our more animal selves, right? So you can literally be of two minds about a particular thing. It's not just about short-term gratification versus long-term consequences. You can be of two minds about something as complex as the death penalty. You can be of two minds about something as complex as the minimum wage. You can see many sides of the argument, and sometimes making a decision is really hard. In many cases, we just have to go with how we feel after deliberating on it. Here's an example of how framing a question or framing an issue can have a profound effect. This is somebody who's trying to play upon the fact that we often examine a question and use a simple emotional heuristic to guide our answer. The heuristic in this case, I'm sorry to say, is that people with dark skin are less deserving of my approval. That's the heuristic here. Because whoever made this picture changed the color and contrast to make the president seem darker. And it was along with a story that had nothing to do with the race of the president. But somebody seeing this picture, what's their automatic emotional heuristic? Somebody who has a tendency towards racial prejudice. Right? You're playing upon that prejudice while conveying something that has nothing to do with it. So if they jump to a conclusion based upon this, it has nothing to do with the evidence. Advertisers and political pundits use these kinds of tricks all the time. Let's talk about scientific skepticism. It turns out that nobody is born a critical thinker. We're born to survive on the savannas of Africa. We're born to be afraid, in many cases, of novel stimuli. That could be a tiger in the bush. Oh, I'm sorry?
Not in Africa.
Right, no tigers in Africa. Thank you. That's a man who knows his science. That could be a lion in the bush. Critically, nobody is born with scientific knowledge. Right? You have a very, very few inborn things, like not walking off the edge of a cliff because gravity will, lead to unpleasant consequences. They've done experiments with babies where they come to the edge of something that's covered in glass. So they won't continue. So there are a few facts about the natural world that we're born with. But this may surprise you. You're not born with any knowledge about quantum mechanics. Okay. The world seems flat. At most scales, it's perfectly reasonable to assume the world is flat. If you're building a house or laying down a soccer field, assuming the world is flat is necessary. Right? The sun seems to circle overhead. An ill relative got better after a costly sacrifice or a specific prayer, so it must have been helpful. We're also born to look for causation, in many cases where the causal impact is illusory. Right? We're not very good inherently at sorting out cause from effect. That's why things like rain dances occur. Some things sound very complicated and enlightened, so they must be true. Right? That sounds like a smart person. Must know what he's talking about. Okay? We must learn critical thinking in science, even if it means replacing cherished and comforting ideas. One of the books I most highly recommend, I think everybody in the whole world should read this book, is The Demon-Haunted World by Carl Sagan. Right? Fantastic book about critical thinking and some of the pitfalls of not applying it. And then you also need to attain some, well, you would be well served by attaining some modicum of knowledge about various scientific topics. You know, watch science programs, watch Cosmos, watch Mythbusters, great example. Watch Nova. Go to YouTube, watch my videos. No self-promotion there. Too often, great harm results not from malice, but from ignorance. And without a good baloney detection kit, Carl Sagan came up with that term, we can be quite easily misled by poor arguments, manipulated emotions, and deluded thinking. At the core of much of these issues is a quest to replace ignorance with evidence-supported knowledge. Scientific skepticism isn't just about doubt for doubt's sake. I've been in situations, I've got a t-shirt that says skeptic. I self-identify as a scientific skeptic. Some people just hear the skeptic part and say, oh, so you don't believe in anything. No, that's not true, right? I'm specifically a scientific skeptic.
You're with gravity.
I'm with gravity. Great, yeah, I like that shirt too. Scientific skepticism isn't just about doubt for doubt's sake, nor is it playing the devil's advocate to every claim about reality. Rather, scientific skepticism pairs an awareness concerning bad argumentation and the way the brain works, with an insistence on evidence and legitimized experience. That is where the science part of scientific skepticism comes into play. My second impersonation of the day, or third, fourth, if you count George Bush. All right. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Right? If somebody says something that just sounds amazing, scientists have invented a machine that can make gasoline from air. Wow, wouldn't that be great? It is an extraordinary claim. It deserves extraordinary evidence to support it. Just because something would be so awesome, like faster than light space travel from your bedroom, you know, astral projection or whatever, just because it sounds really cool, doesn't mean that it's true. If it's an extraordinary claim that breaks your conceptions about what is real in your experience, then it requires extraordinary evidence. It pays to keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain is fall out. Somebody once approached Carl Sagan and said, "What do you think about aliens? Do you think aliens exist? Come on, what does your gut tell you about this? How do you feel? What's your gut telling you?" Whoops, let me go to this one. I try not to think with my gut. If I'm serious about understanding the world, thinking with anything besides my brain, as tempting as it might be, is likely to get me into trouble. And then there's this wonderful claim you see all the time. I've got a theory of gravity. I believe that the Earth sucks. Specifically, I think that when you take a region of space and you put an entity in that region of space, it causes this space-time to evacuate the location where you put that object. So if you put the Earth in space, it's evacuating a huge amount of space-time, and that space-time wants to come back into where the Earth is, and so it's pushing everything down onto the Earth. I dare you to refute that. Let's try objects of different density, but the same size. Do they form the same kind of gravity? Now, on the face of things, that's not such a dumb claim, because science has a lot of weird, mysterious things like gravitational fields that we can't necessarily see. Right? So it's not a bad idea that something pushes something out of the way and it's causing a pressure to push back down. It's not a dumb idea. We laugh at it because we know it's not true. We've had a little bit of science education. But you can make a simple test for that. Take two things with different density that take up the same amount of space and see if they have the same gravitational attraction associated with them. The answer is no. it must have something to do with something other than their physical size, right? So that's where critical thinking in science comes in. So, just because I've got this idea of gravity, which happens to not be true, it doesn't mean that because you laughed at me that I'm suddenly vindicated. You laughed at me, therefore I must be saying something true because they laughed at Galileo, etc. The fact that some geniuses were laughed at does not imply that all who are laughed at are geniuses. They laughed at Columbus, they laughed at Fulton, they laughed at the Wright brothers, but they also laughed at Roosevelt. We talked a little bit about scientific progress, and this is one of my favorite depictions of this. Over time, our models of reality approach with ever greater fidelity and an accurate description of the phenomena we apprehend in nature. We strive constantly to build models of reality that enable us to comprehend and interact with our world, and perhaps with brand new worlds with ever-increasing fidelity and accuracy. Scientific skepticism is the explicit and intentional exhibition of causation and caution when confronting arguments and claims. A caution that recognizes validity of and acceptance for arguments must in all cases be based on evidence. Further, weeding through evidence, assembling and assessing it is a slow process. It's uncomfortable for many. By nature, we are lazy creatures and prefer to make snap decisions based upon uncritical heuristics and poor, if any, evidence. I suppose you can get through life using simple heuristics. You can eat and poop and do many jobs in society that you will be rewarded for. You can compartmentalize your deep and critical thinking into a few, very few domains, perhaps related to your profession, and then go on blithely making lightning facts that inevitably bias and often incorrect judgments about many complexities regarding the way the world works. As a result, though, you'll be left with a bag of poop and innumerable self-delusions about reality. Maybe this is okay. Maybe it doesn't matter. Or maybe it does. Maybe it matters when you watch the news, discuss and assess issues with your friend, or when you advertise and share your opinions on a topic. Facebook, anyone? Maybe it matters a lot when you vote with a pencil on election days, or with your pocketbook and hard-earned pay. Let me give you an example of a very sad circumstance around critical thinking. My partner Dave wasn't feeling well today, so he didn't join us. But this is a true thing that is currently happening to him. He's taking a college course on world cultures. And in this college course, his professor says it's plausible that the pyramids were built by aliens. In fact, I would go further than that and say that most, if not all, of the world's religions probably came from aliens. You all taking notes? And this same professor showed a series of videos in his class about people walking on hot coals and piercing their limbs with needles. And one of the most amazing things, apparently there's this very wise man in the Orient somewhere who says that he has lived 70 years without eating. And that eating is just an affect. It's just something we believe we need. You don't really need it. Now, a few people have questioned this and they follow the man around a little bit, but this man occasionally disappears into a house with his relatives and he says no media, no press, no sycophants are allowed because I'm spending quality time with my family. I wonder what else he's doing. Anyway, this professor, Dave's professor, seems to honestly believe in this claptrap, right? Here's the kicker. This same professor talking about world cultures also teaches a class in critical thinking. Is scientific skepticism important? Yeah. Now, I want to point out to you the similarity between these two curves. Right? One looks like you just kind of rotated it. The curve on the right is an exponential curve. All right? It's something that grows without bound over time. Right? The curve on the left is something that approaches a fixed limit over time. Well, they look similar. And if I were being duplicitous, if I were being duplicitous, I might put a curve, one of these curves in a paper or a persuasive diatribe that I wrote, and maybe I'll just turn it by 90 degrees and say, look, this is exponential, when it isn't. Well, that curve, that exponential curve, has been invoked to explain lots of things. The growth in world economic output, the rate of scientific progress, the miniaturization of electronic components and computerized circuits. It seems to be on this exponential trajectory. And a very smart man, Ray Kurzweil, a man who has many ideas and inventions that I cherish, looks at this as a real representation of the way computer capabilities are improving over time. And he says, well, not too much longer from now, computers might be essentially infinitely capable. And he calls this the singularity. And he says humanity is moving toward a singularity where computers become self-aware and nearly omnipotent or omniscient. Right? Maybe he's looking at the wrong curve. Maybe other people who extrapolate indefinitely into the future are looking at the wrong curve. Back in the 1800s in New York City, they started worrying about the amount of horse poop in the streets. If this continues for another 100 years, then the skyscrapers will, well, at the time they're 10 stories tall, will be essentially buried in horse poop. Right? So thinking along exponential trains of thought can often lead to catastrophic outcomes. Nature doesn't tend to behave this way. Nature tends to behave this way. If you take a couple of points away from today, maybe one of them is the demon-haunted world, take this away. This graph is a far more accurate representation of the way natural or real systems behave. There's a part down at the beginning that looks kind of flat. It looks almost linear, or it may look like there's essentially no change at all. For thousands of years, human technological progress was very slow. Stone tools and wooden wheels and horse labor. Right? For a long, long time, not much happened. And it may be that we return to a similar state in the future, especially with regards to our economy. I gave a talk a couple of years ago about the Death Star and economics and other topics related to perpetual growth in the world economy and industry. Well, in reality, there will be some kind of ceiling. Right? Populations tend to grow until they run out of food. So this curve may not actually look like this, it may have a collapse. Right? But when thinking about people who make claims or thinking about arguments that say we're on an exponential trajectory, please replace that sentiment with this in most cases. Okay? Here's some examples. The 100-meter dash times, right? For a long time, we started making seconds of improvement, or maybe fractions of a second of improvement, to the point where we've discovered about the minimum amount of time it takes a human being to make a 100-meter dash. Population growth tends to look like this. Economic growth will tend to look like this. Computer miniaturization will tend to look like this. At some point, that mysterious quantum mechanics becomes relevant. There's no singularity. right? That's my own personal bold claim. I think the data is on my side. Oh. Vehicle speeds, right? Cars started off going 5 miles an hour, and now they go about 100 miles an hour at best. Typical cars maybe 60 miles an hour. So vehicle speeds will level off. Supersonic airplane, right? I want to talk about that. One of the things you can find is that you can stack these curves called logistic curves up like this, and that's kind of a paradigm shift where you change the very nature of the problem. So maybe transportation happened this way for a long time, and it was only so fast that a horse and buggy could go. And eventually we got these things, and there's only so fast that a car can go. Right? So technological innovation, one of the benefits it has, is it can change the argument, it can change the trajectory. We can do something similar with a horse-drawn plow. Using a horse-drawn plow, there's a certain practical limit to the amount of land you can farm. But then these things came along. Eventually, we'll find a technology that one way or another is very costly or physically impossible to improve upon. Right? Once something starts moving at the speed of light, we won't be able to go any faster. That is the ultimate top of nature's logistic curve. So you can stack these curves as technological progress brings you to new plateaus of innovation. But ultimately, even though it looks like an exponential growth, nature and the fundamental ceilings that you encounter with natural physical processes still play a role.
Do you think that's true with climate change, with global warming?
There are different tipping points. I talked about this a little bit, I forget which talk it was, but the Earth has gone through many different periods where it enters into what are called metastable states. So for a long period of time, maybe a few million years, maybe even a billion years, the Earth can exist in a particular state where it looks very flat and linear and unchanging. And then it starts changing and it might enter a whole new domain of quasi-stability. So with climate change, it is highly plausible that the Earth will be driven by warming factors and heat-trapping gases into a new quasi-stable normal. But that normal won't be as pleasant for us as the normal we see now. All right, I want to talk a little bit about some of this stuff. Next month, we're going to focus a lot on science versus pseudoscience. Now, in the philosophy of science, there's this really big issue called the demarcation problem. What is science and what isn't science? Let me give you a preview with one example. Multiple universe theories. Right? There are several different paradigms currently under investigation in the physical sciences that can lead to a plausible conclusion that there are parallel universes. I won't go into the details. I talked about some of that last year, and it's up on the video for cosmology on YouTube. But there are different physical theories that can lead to the idea of multiple universes. The problem is that a universe, by definition, is everything you can ever interact with, observe, or do an experiment on. So a different universe is quite literally something you cannot do an experiment on, cannot observe, cannot ever interact with. Is it science to talk about multiple universes? Right? There isn't yet a definitive answer to that among philosophers. Physicists generally come to a different conclusion. They say, well, this is a necessary condition. Multiple universes are a necessary condition for some of our theories to be internally consistent. Therefore, multiple universes are likely true. But is it really science or is it philosophy? We're going to talk about the demarcation problem. We're going to talk about science versus nonsense next year. I'm sorry, next month. Remember that scientists are people too. They cherry pick their data. They are subjected to confirmation bias. That's one of the reasons that the institution of science does peer review. Even peer review doesn't always work. But it's about the best we've figured out to be able to do regarding understanding the real world and gathering evidence about it. If you're presented with some extraordinary claim, like somebody who can pierce their skin with a needle repeatedly, or somebody who can walk slowly across coals hot enough to melt iron, whatever the case may be, if you find yourself encountering a situation where somebody is providing very persuasive visual evidence that these kinds of things are happening, don't call these people. Call this guy. Right? And it turns out that there's a whole class of people in our cultures who have, as their job, figuring out how to trick you, how to exhibit outcomes that seem extraordinary or supernatural. And the best magicians are the ones who have personal integrity to tell you that they're tricking you. Right? Penn and Teller are an excellent example of that. James Randi is another example of that, and there are many more. Right? There are cases, let's see, is it in this book? Yeah. This book, Sleights of Mind. So the authors of this, a husband and wife, decided they wanted to learn magic. And they learned magic so well that they were eventually indoctrinated, whatever it is, into the American School of Magicians. Right? So they became pretty good at magic. And they learned all kinds of interesting things, like magic tricks that work on adults don't often work on infants or toddlers or 7-year-olds, because your brain changes, your expectations of reality change. Right? One of the reasons why when a young person is watching television and it shows a monster attacking from a UFO, they're likely to be more scared, because they haven't developed the mental tools to separate reality from fiction, even in extraordinary cases like a monster coming out of a UFO. Right? People, as they develop, young children have different cognitive skills than adults. Some adults never progress very far along the cognitive development spectrum. But getting back to my point, these people recount an instance where there's a magician doing some trick. And these folks were sitting with a physicist, a good friend of theirs who was a physicist, who saw this, and the physicist's reaction was, "Oh my God, I had no idea you could do that. Wow." Right? Well, you can't do that. Right? But the physicists had been trained that evidence, experiential data, is gathered to validate a hypothesis. He experienced or apprehended some new data, and as a good scientist, he was willing to change his mind about reality. Right? So if you encounter some amazing claims, sometimes you shouldn't call a scientist, sometimes you should call a magician to help you figure it out. I recommend these books, Bad Arguments. There are many different books that talk about collections of logical fallacies and give examples. Crimes Against Logic is another one. I've mentioned a couple of books previously, Thinking Fast and Slow, and The Demon Haunted World, and there are many others. And that's it. I now have time for questions. Thank you. Questions, comments?
I was thinking that one thing that happens in our world now, I've seen talk and discussion about it, is that basically people use their brains and their logic to defend arguments that they've already decided upon.
Yeah,
In other words, yeah.
kind of a confirmation bias. Yeah, and cherry-picking data, right? Raising the minimum wage will be bad. Or implementing the Affordable Care Act will be bad. It turns out that there were statistical and economic arguments made on both sides of the fence that the health care plan would be good and the health care plan would be bad. And going into it, it was hard to sort through it, especially not being a healthcare professional, what was real and what wasn't. Sometimes we have to give up our personal and vested opinion and listen to what the consensus expertise is. This is something that I take very seriously. Most of my lectures have not been about my ideas. I'm not a practicing scientist. I'm not up here telling you about my research into the way the phones work, right? I'm up here trying to convey a sense of understanding about some of the extraordinary physical and biological and social things that legions of experts have shown to be true. So when confronted with statistics that can support a given argument, it's really hard to weed through it. As it turns out, what I've read, again, is that the people who are saying implementing healthcare will not cause employers to fire a bunch of people, will not cause taxes to go up appreciably for most Americans, those people, it turns out, were more right than the people who said it will lead to mass layoffs and other negative things. So cherry picking can have bad consequences, and it's really hard to sort out what's true from what isn't sometimes. Yeah.
I'm old enough to remember, well, FDR put in a top marginal tax rate of 91%. He tried for 100%, but he only got 91. That lasted until Kennedy in the 70s, when it went down to 7, or in the 60s, when it went down to 7.
Okay.
We now have a marginal tax rate of 39.5%, I guess. Thomas Piketty's book on capital in the 21st century says that we will become a nation of renters but we need, he believes we ought to go back to about 80%. As a top marginal tax. So I wonder what you might have to say about that.
Yeah, so one of my favorite scientific studies, I didn't have time to talk about it in my economics talk, but I've talked about it incidentally in other discussions I've had. There were a couple of French physicists who back in the 90s did some simulations. And there are different kinds of, this sounds like a bit of a digression about tying back together. There are different kinds of networks. There are highly connected networks where any entity is connected to a few nearby entities, and it looks kind of like a fishing net. Right? There are networks that are centralized networks, or I'm drawing a blank on the name, but it's essentially everything connects to one single central point. It looks kind of like a starburst, right? I'm sorry, what? A star network, yeah, very well. And then there's a third kind of network that I've really enjoyed studying and learning about called a scale-free network. And in those networks, there's a very interesting simple rule that applies, and that is the likelihood of an entity gaining a new transactional connection is exactly determined by the number of connections it already has. And what that leads to is things like our international airport network, where there are a few big international hubs for air networks and a few small and lots of smaller hubs. The internet tends to look like that. It's got a few big critical hubs and lots of smaller hubs. It turns out that these French physicists found that if you describe economic connections and economic prosperity by means of network theory, you find that the economy can be best modeled as a scale-free network. One of the implications of that is something you all already heard, which is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. That is a mathematical certainty as an outcome from a scale-free economic network. They found that in order to interfere, in order to stop that from continuing indefinitely, to where the rich are phenomenally rich and the poor are phenomenally impoverished. They have to artificially impose some constraints on the number of connections, the amount of wealth that the best connected, the most prosperous economic players have to have. And that's where taxes come into play. So one of the concerns that some economists have, and the United Nations has, and that many progressive think tanks have, is that inequality is the single most significant social concern for the 21st century. And one of the implications of that is that the redistribution of wealth in the form of taxes doesn't take the form that it needs to take for a more prosperous society as a whole. I haven't decided with that. That has more to do with some of my personal biases. But there is some science to show that the rich will get richer and the poor will get poorer, and that something external has to perturb that so that it doesn't continue to the point of catastrophe. Well, I think you're right. I think the marginal tax, my opinion is, and many other people's opinion is, that the marginal tax rate needs to go up to keep a catastrophe from happening. Other questions or comments? Yeah.
All right. Something that has always kind of fascinated me is the concept of the collective consciousness as an actual energy that can somehow be manifested in the physical realm. Like, meaning that if you get enough people, like, say in like a sports arena, and those people are all thinking or dreading something that
Doesn't have a real effect.
well, like something strange will actually happen in that moment that actually confirms, like an outcome is created that confirms the dread. So when to narrow down, the example that I was thinking of was, the Barton situation in the 2003 National League Championship Series in Wrigley Field. When, they were so close, everything was so good, they were finally going to get to the World Series. And then, a strange thing happens. And then all of a sudden, that whole ballpark, just, reports, editorial reports, just that a hush, you can actually hear it, watching on TV, but a sense of dread encompassed, that whole ballpark.
So did the dread happen after the random negative event?
Yes, but the very next play was a very reliable shortstop, just completely fans on a normal ground ball. That would have ended the threat, would have kept everything going great. Cubs would have gone to the World Series.
So let me make a couple comments about a couple of the different threads in your supposition. One is, it kind of reminds me of the power of prayer, the power of intentional, very deeply held, committed well wishes for someone, etc. There was a study, I think it was at Harvard several years ago, where a researcher said that he had found a real correlative effect between prayer and positive outcomes. And the world press just went nuts about that, right? Wow, maybe there's something to this positive thinking, prayer thing. Upon closer examination, and as others try to redo his studies, remember, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The evidence supporting that assertion just vanished, unfortunately. It would be nice if we lived in a world where wishful thinking could lead to some change in the physical world. Sports players are human beings subjected to emotional stresses. So if the fans are whooping and hollering or booing and hissing or stunned into silence, that probably has an impact on people's performance. There have been studies done where they take people doing manual tasks and they increase their stress level.
Yeah.
It turns out that according to these studies, people have a pretty good tolerance for working well. This is particularly interesting for the military and the ones who funded these. People work fine up until you reach a particular stress level, and then doing something simple like pushing a button or writing or catching a ball becomes almost impossible because the stress has reached such a point that you just can't concentrate on any manual tasks. So I I don't know of any scientific evidence supporting the idea that group thinking or some kind of assault can lead to changes in the physical world, but I am aware of many that say that it can impact the behavior of an individual.
And he had to beat Kentucky yesterday.
Those states, they hate each other, I guess.
Call it the jinx effect. I mean, like, same kind of thing. I'm just,
Yeah.
you can explain it that, like a sports broadcaster will be sitting there watching a game, and a guy will sit at the free throw line. And he'll be like, this guy hasn't missed it 20 tries. Clank.
Oh, yeah. That's another logical fallacy that's in some of these books, that the past is a predictor of the future. He hasn't missed in 20 shots, therefore he's not likely to miss in the next. Probably has more. Mike, you had a question?
I was just thinking of some aspects of groupthink that kind of apply to what you were saying. And for example, they did a study in how do these starlings all fly in space and all coordinate their flight and so on. And there's a lot of interesting studies that address that. The other one was they talked about how herds of deer, and they got led by the leader of the deer led them off to a certain drinking fountain. Or
Right.
on at a certain point in time, it was decided for them to do that, and it all looked, for all appearances, for quite a while, that this deer made a decision, and all the other deer in this herd followed this male deer, the leader deer, off to this place. When it was realized and studied later, the other perception of it was that the male deer, the head deer, was very aware of what everyone else was doing, and when more than 50% of the deer headed aimed a certain direction, he led off, right?
So there's a quote, I didn't share this during the body of my talk, but I think this is relevant to what you're pointing out. This is from Massimo Pigliucci, who wrote, he's a skeptic from I think he's from Italy. But he wrote a wonderful book called Nonsense on Stilts. If you want to have your reading list. Oh, beautiful book. This is a quote from him in that book. Just because we are curious animals, there is no assurance that nature behaves in a way that allows us to get answers to every mystery that happens to intrigue us. Right? So the last lecture, the last program of my Quest series for this year in May is going to be about unsolved scientific mysteries. What I would say, by then you should have encountered enough scientific and critical thinking to say just because we can't explain it yet doesn't mean we have to invent gods and magic to explain it. Just because we don't have an explanation doesn't mean there isn't an explanation. As you're going through this, approach these things with a healthy amount of scientific skepticism. Thank you very much. See you next time.